The wrench slipped from Marcus Rivera's oil-stained fingers as the stranger collapsed against the chain-link fence of Rivera's auto repair, her designer heels clicking helplessly against the cracked asphalt. Steam billowed from beneath the hood of her silver BMW like smoke signals of desperation, and Marcus could hear the telltale death rattle of an overheated engine even from 30 feet away. It was 7:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in October, the kind of evening when the desert wind carried the scent of sage and disappointment through the streets of Bakersfield, California. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "Please," the woman called out, her voice cracking like dried leather. "Please, I know you're closed, but I don't know what else to do." Marcus wiped his hands on the red shop rag that had been his constant companion for 8 years, ever since he'd scraped together enough money to lease this corner lot with its single-bay garage and dreams bigger than his bank account. The fluorescent lights inside cast long shadows across the concrete floor where his 6-year-old daughter Emma's chalk drawing still decorated the corners, stick figures of their family holding hands beneath a sun that never seemed to set in her imagination. The stranger pressed her face against the fence, and Marcus could see the mascara streaks that traced dark rivers down her cheeks. Her blonde hair was pulled back in what had probably been an elegant bun hours earlier, but now, loose strands framed her face like a portrait of exhaustion. She wore a navy blazer that probably cost more than Marcus made in a month, but desperation made everyone equal under the harsh glow of streetlights. "Ma'am, I'm really sorry, but we're closed," Marcus said, though something in his chest tightened as he spoke the words. His own mother's voice echoed in his memory. "Mijo, you never know when you might be the only hope someone has left." "My car just died," she continued, her hands gripping the metal links like prison bars. "I've been driving for 6 hours straight from Los Angeles, and I have to be in Sacramento by morning. It's my daughter. She's in the hospital, and they said—" Her voice broke entirely, and she leaned her forehead against the fence. Marcus felt his resolve crumble like the old adobe buildings that dotted Bakersfield's forgotten neighborhoods. He'd been in his office, balancing books that never seemed to balance, trying to figure out how to pay Emma's school fees and keep the lights on for another month. The calculator on his desk showed numbers that painted pictures of late notices and tough conversations, but none of that mattered when someone else's world was falling apart in his parking lot. "Okay," he said, walking toward the gate. "Let me take a look." The woman's name was Sarah, she told him between grateful sobs, though she never offered a last name. As Marcus popped the hood of her BMW, he noticed details that didn't quite add up. The car was immaculate except for this mechanical failure. The leather interior smelled like expensive perfume mixed with coffee and anxiety, and her hands, while manicured, bore the subtle calluses of someone who worked with purpose rather than privilege. The engine was a disaster. The radiator had given up completely, coolant pooled beneath the car like automotive blood, and the temperature gauge was buried so deep in the red zone it might as well have been screaming. This wasn't a quick fix. This was surgery. "How bad is it?" Sarah asked, hovering at his shoulder. Marcus straightened up, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his wrist. The October evening still held the day's heat like a grudge, and working under the hood felt like sticking his head into an oven. "Well, you need a new radiator, definitely. Probably a thermostat, some hoses, and I'll need to flush the whole cooling system. Best case scenario, you're looking at 6 hours of work and about $800 in parts." Sarah's face went pale. $800? Plus labor, Marcus added quietly, already regretting the honesty that his father had hammered into him. "Look, there's a motel about 2 miles down the road. Why don't you get some rest, and in the morning—" "I don't have until morning," Sarah interrupted. "And I don't have $800. She looked at her phone, and Marcus could see her hands trembling. "My daughter Emma, she's only 7, and she's been asking for me since yesterday. The doctor said she's stable, but she keeps asking why Mommy isn't there." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Emma. His own Emma was asleep in their apartment above Mrs. Gutierrez's bakery 3 blocks away, probably dreaming of the Halloween costume they'd been planning, a dragon that breathed glitter instead of fire, because Emma believed the world needed more sparkle and less fear. "Let me make some calls," Marcus heard himself saying. "Maybe I can work something out." But even as he spoke, he knew there was no magic phone call that would change the mathematics of automotive repair. Parts cost what they cost, and bills demanded payment regardless of circumstances. Marcus had learned this lesson during the long months after his wife Christina had died. when Emma was barely 2, and every day felt like trying to build a bridge out of hope and determination alone. He called his parts supplier Danny Morales, who ran Southwest Auto Parts out of a warehouse that smelled like motor oil and broken dreams. Danny had been in the business for 30 years and had a heart bigger than his inventory, but even friendship had limits when rent was due. "Marcus, you know I'd help if I could," Danny said over the phone, the sound of a baseball game playing in the background. "But you're already carrying a balance, and my wife will kill me if I extend any more credit right now. The economy's got everyone squeezed tight." Marcus hung up and stared at the BMW's engine like it held the secrets of the universe. Behind him, he could hear Sarah pacing, her heels clicking out a rhythm of anxiety on the concrete. Every few seconds, her phone would buzz with text messages, and each notification seemed to make her shoulders curl inward like she was protecting herself from invisible blows. "What if I leave the car?" Sarah asked suddenly. "As collateral, I mean. It's worth more than the repair, right? You could keep it until I figure out how to pay." Marcus considered this. The BMW was probably worth $20,000, maybe more, but keeping someone's car hostage felt wrong, like holding their life for ransom. Besides, what good would a luxury car do him? He couldn't sell it without a title, and it would just take up space in his already crowded lot. "That's not how I do business," he said. "Look, why don't you call someone? Family? Friends? Maybe someone could wire you the money." Sarah laughed, but it was the kind of laughter that lived next door to tears. "If I had people to call, do you think I'd be standing in a stranger's parking lot begging for help?" The weight of her words settled between them like dust after a desert storm. Marcus understood that kind of isolation, the way life could strip away everyone except the people who needed you most. After Christina died, his own family had scattered like tumbleweeds, his mother moving back to Mexico, his brother joining the military, friends slowly disappearing into their own complicated lives until it was just Marcus and Emma against the world. He made a decision that his practical mind screamed against, but his heart demanded. "I'll fix it." "What?" "I'll fix your car. Tonight. No charge." Sarah stared at him like he'd just offered to hand her the moon. "You can't be serious." Dead serious. Marcus was already moving toward his parts cabinet, calculating what he had in stock versus what he'd need to order. "I've got most of what you need here, and what I don't have, I'll figure out. It'll take me most of the night, but I'll get you back on the road." "But why?" Sarah asked. "You don't even know me." Marcus paused, his hand on the cabinet door. How could he explain that sometimes kindness was the only currency that mattered? That he'd learned from his own desperate moments, that help often came from the most unexpected places? That his daughter Emma had taught him that the best people were the ones who shared their lunch even when they were hungry themselves? "Because someone did the same for me once," he said simply, "and because your daughter Emma is waiting for you, just like my Emma would be waiting for me." Stories like this remind us why kindness matters. If you're moved by Marcus's decision to help a stranger, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear this message today. The first tear that rolled down Sarah's cheek caught the fluorescent light like a fallen star. The night stretched ahead of them like an uncharted road, full of possibilities and mechanical mysteries. Marcus had no idea that in fixing one broken car, he was about to discover that sometimes the people who need saving the most are the ones who've spent their lives saving others. As he reached for his toolbox, the desert wind whispered through the fence, carrying with it the promise that this Tuesday evening in October would be unlike any other in the history of Rivera's auto repair. Marcus Rivera had never been the kind of man who made impulsive decisions. Every choice in his life had been measured twice, cut once, as his father used to say while teaching him carpentry in the garage behind their old house on the east side of town. But as he rolled his toolbox toward the broken BMW, he felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling across his shoulders like an old jacket that had molded itself to his frame over years of wear. The clock on the wall read 8:23 p.m., which meant Emma would be finishing her homework with Mrs. Gutierrez upstairs, probably asking her honorary abuela when Daddy was coming home. Emma was 6 years old and had inherited her mother's ability to sense when something was different, when the rhythm of their carefully orchestrated life shifted even slightly off its axis. "You sure about this?" Sarah asked, watching Marcus arrange his tools with the precision of a surgeon preparing for a delicate operation. "I mean, really sure? Because I can try to find another way." "There is no other way," Marcus said, not looking up from his socket set. "At least, not one that gets you to Sacramento by morning. He selected a wrench and held it up to the light, checking for any imperfections that might cause it to slip at the wrong moment. Besides, I've got nothing but time tonight. This wasn't entirely true. Marcus had a stack of invoices waiting for his attention, 3 estimates to write up for jobs he desperately needed to land, and a conversation with Emma about Halloween costumes that he'd been postponing for a week. But something about Sarah's desperation reminded him of his own dark nights after Christina died, when he'd stand in Emma's doorway watching her sleep and wonder how he was going to hold their small world together with hands that seemed too clumsy for single parenthood. The first step was draining the old coolant, a process that would take 30 minutes and give Marcus time to really study the damage. As the green liquid gurgled into his drain pan, he found himself studying Sarah from the corner of his eye. She'd taken off her blazer and rolled up her sleeves, revealing arms that were lean and strong, with a small scar on her left wrist that looked like it might have come from surgical instruments rather than accidents. "You mentioned you've been driving for 6 hours, Marcus said, breaking the silence that had settled between them like dust on unused furniture. "That's a long trip. You must be exhausted." Sarah nodded, leaning against the workbench with the careful posture of someone who'd learned to hold herself together through sheer force of will. "I haven't slept much in the past 3 days. Emma's been in the hospital since Sunday night, and they keep saying she's going to be fine, but..." She trailed off, staring at her phone screen like it might reveal secrets about the future. "What happened to her?" Marcus asked gently, though he wasn't sure if he was crossing a line. Some stories were too tender to share with strangers, no matter how kind those strangers might be. "Appendicitis," Sarah said, the word coming out like a small explosion. "She woke up Sunday morning complaining about her stomach, and I thought maybe she'd eaten too much ice cream the night before. We went to urgent care, then the emergency room, and then suddenly there were surgeons and consent forms and all these machines beeping around her bed." Marcus nodded, understanding the particular terror that came with watching your child suffer while feeling completely powerless to fix it. When Emma had pneumonia 2 winters ago, he'd spent 72 hours in a hospital chair that seemed designed by someone who'd never experienced human anatomy, drinking coffee that tasted like liquid regret, and making bargains with a god he wasn't sure he believed in. "She's okay now?" he asked. "The surgery went well," Sarah said, and for the first time since she'd appeared at his fence, her voice carried something besides desperation, but there were complications afterward. Her body didn't respond to the medication the way they expected, and her fever kept spiking. They finally got it under control yesterday, but she's been asking for me constantly." "Where have you been?" Sarah was quiet for so long that Marcus thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Working in Los Angeles. I had 3 surgeries scheduled this week, and I couldn't just cancel them. People's lives were depending on me." Something clicked in Marcus's mind like a puzzle piece finding its home. The calloused hands, the way she'd immediately understood the seriousness of engine damage, the careful way she spoke about medical complications. "You're a doctor." It wasn't a question, and Sarah didn't treat it like one. "Surgeon," she corrected. "Pediatric cardiac surgery specifically. I fix children's hearts for a living." The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. A woman who spent her days repairing the most delicate mechanisms in the human body, now stranded because she couldn't fix her own car. "That's why you can't leave your patients." "Exactly." Sarah pulled out her phone and showed Marcus a photo of a little girl with dark curls and a gap-toothed grin, lying in a hospital bed but still managing to smile at the camera. "This is Emma. She's so brave, braver than I am most of the time. But she's 7 years old, and she just wants her mom to be there when she wakes up from her naps." The photo hit Marcus harder than he'd expected. The little girl looked nothing like his Emma, but something about her expression. The mixture of courage and vulnerability that all children wore when the world got too big and scary made his chest tighten with recognition. "How long have you been doing this?" he asked. "Surgery, I mean." 12 years, Sarah said, tucking the phone back into her pocket like she was protecting something precious. "I did my residency at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, then a fellowship in Boston. I've been back in LA for 5 years now, working at Cedars-Sinai." Marcus did quick math in his head. "That's a lot of school, a lot of years." 15 years of training if you count everything, Sarah confirmed. "Medical school, residency, fellowship. I was 34 when I finally felt like a real surgeon instead of someone just pretending to know what they were doing." "And Emma's father?" Sarah's expression closed off like a door slamming shut. Not in the picture. It's just been Emma and me since she was born. Marcus understood that tone, the way single parents learned to make their voices into walls when certain subjects came up. He'd perfected the same technique when people asked about Christina, when well-meaning neighbors wondered if he'd ever think about dating again, when Emma's teacher suggested that she might benefit from more female influences in her life. The coolant had finished draining, leaving behind the metallic smell of automotive mortality. Marcus began the delicate process of removing the radiator, each bolt telling its own story of heat and stress and miles traveled. The BMW had been well maintained. Someone had cared for it, changed its oil regularly, rotated its tires. But even the best-maintained cars couldn't run forever on hope and determination. "What about you?" Sarah asked. "How long have you been fixing cars?" "Since I was Emma's age," Marcus said, wrestling with a particularly stubborn bolt. "My dad was a mechanic for the city, fire trucks, ambulances, police cars. He used to bring me to work on weekends, and I'd sit in the corner with a toy wrench, pretending to help. By the time I was 12, I could change brake pads by myself." "And you always wanted to have your own shop?" Marcus paused in his work, considering the question. "I always wanted to fix things," he said finally. "Cars, lawnmowers, my mom's sewing machine when it got temperamental. There's something satisfying about taking something broken and making it work again, you know? Like you're giving it another chance at life." "I understand that," Sarah said quietly. "It's the same feeling I get when I fix a child's heart. When I can take something that's not working properly and make it strong enough to last a lifetime." They worked in comfortable silence after that, Marcus methodically disassembling the cooling system while Sarah held flashlights and handed him tools like they'd been working together for years. The desert night air was cooling down, carrying the scent of sagebrush and distant barbecue grills where other families were finishing their Tuesday evening routines. At 10:30 p.m., Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Mrs. Gutierrez. "Emma is asleep. I told her you were helping someone who needed you. She said that's what heroes do. Sleep tight, Mijo." Marcus showed the text to Sarah, who read it and then looked at him with something that might have been wonder. "Heroes," she repeated. "Your daughter sounds like she has you figured out." "She's smarter than both of us put together," Marcus said, and he meant it. Emma had a way of seeing the world that made complicated things simple and simple things magical. She collected bottle caps because she thought they looked like tiny shields for fairy warriors. She saved half her allowance every week for emergencies, though she'd never explained what kind of emergencies a 6-year-old might anticipate. She believed that every sunset was painted specifically for whoever needed to see it most that day. "Tell me about her," Sarah said, settling onto a shop stool like she was preparing for a long story. Marcus found himself talking about Emma while his hands worked, describing how she'd started kindergarten with a backpack full of Band-Aids because she wanted to be ready to help anyone who got hurt at recess. How she'd spent an entire afternoon making a sorry card for the earthworm she'd accidentally stepped on in their garden. How she'd announced last month that she wanted to be either a veterinarian or a superhero when she grew up, and when Marcus asked her to choose, she'd looked at him like he'd suggested something ridiculous and said, "Why can't I be both?" "She sounds extraordinary," Sarah said. "She is," Marcus agreed, "but she's also just a kid, you know. She still needs help tying her shoes, and she cries when we run out of her favorite cereal, and sometimes she wakes up in the middle of the night because she's worried about things she can't even name." "The universal fears," Sarah said. "My Emma does the same thing. Last week she asked me what happens to thoughts when you're done thinking them, and then she couldn't sleep because she was worried about all the thoughts that might get lost." Marcus smiled, imagining 2 little girls in different cities, lying awake and wondering about the mysteries of existence. How do you explain something like that? I told her that thoughts never really go away, they just become part of who we are, like ingredients in a recipe. All our thoughts mix together to make us who we're supposed to be. "That's beautiful," Marcus said, and he meant it. "I'll have to remember that one." By midnight, Marcus had removed the old radiator and was fitting the new one into place. His back ached from bending over the engine compartment, and his hands were stained with coolant and grease. But he felt the satisfaction that came with solving problems one bolt at a time. This was what he was good at, taking things apart and putting them back together, making order out of mechanical chaos. Sarah had proven to be an excellent assistant, anticipating which tool he'd need next and holding components steady while he worked. Her hands were precise and sure, the hands of someone who'd learned to work under pressure, where mistakes could cost more than money. "How did you end up in Bakersfield?" she asked as Marcus began connecting the new hoses. "This seems like a long way from anywhere." Marcus laughed, though there wasn't much humor in it. "Christina and I moved here right after Emma was born. Cost of living was lower than LA, and we thought it would be a good place to raise a family. Slower pace, you know? Less traffic, more space for kids to be kids." Christina was Emma's mom. Yeah. Marcus focused intently on the hose connection, using the mechanical precision to keep his emotions steady. She was a teacher. 3rd grade. She loved kids. All kids, not just Emma. She used to say that every child was someone's whole world, and they deserved to be treated that way. "Past tense," Sarah observed gently. "Cancer," Marcus said, the word still feeling like swallowing glass even after 4 years. "Ovarian." By the time they found it, it had spread too far for surgery to help. She fought for 18 months, did everything the doctors recommended, but— "I'm so sorry," Sarah said, and Marcus could hear in her voice that she understood the weight of those words, how insufficient they were, and how necessary they remained. "Emma was 2 when Christina died," Marcus continued, "old enough to know something was wrong, too young to really understand what death meant. For months afterward, she kept asking when Mommy was coming home from the hospital." They both fell quiet after that, the weight of shared loss settling between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. Marcus finished the hose connections and moved on to installing the new thermostat, each task bringing them closer to getting Sarah back on the road toward her own Emma. At 1:15 a.m., as Marcus was filling the cooling system with fresh coolant, Sarah's phone rang. She answered it immediately, her voice shifting into what Marcus recognized as professional mode. "Dr. Mitchell? Yes, this is Dr. Sarah Chen. What? When? Okay, I understand. Yes, I'm driving through the night. I should be there by 7 a.m. No, don't wake her. Let her sleep. I'll be there when she opens her eyes." She hung up and turned to Marcus with an expression that was part relief, part renewed urgency. "The nurses say Emma's fever broke completely, and she's sleeping peacefully for the first time since Sunday, but she keeps telling everyone who'll listen that her mommy is coming to take her home." "Dr. Chen," Marcus repeated, "so now I know your last name." Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her all night. "Sarah Chen, pediatric cardiac surgeon and apparently terrible car owner. And you're Marcus Rivera, single dad and guardian angel to stranded doctors." "Just a mechanic," Marcus corrected, but he found himself smiling back. "Just a mechanic who's spending his entire night fixing a stranger's car for free," Sarah pointed out. "That's not just anything." Marcus started the engine, and the BMW purred to life like it had never been sick at all. The temperature gauge climbed steadily to normal operating range and stayed there, the cooling fans cycling on and off exactly as they should. He let it run for 10 minutes, checking for leaks, monitoring the gauges, making sure his work was solid enough to carry Sarah safely through the desert night. "It's beautiful," Sarah said, listening to the engine's steady rhythm. "You really did it." "We did it," Marcus corrected. "I couldn't have managed without an extra pair of hands." As they cleaned up the tools and disposed of the old parts, Marcus found himself reluctant to see Sarah drive away. Over the past 5 hours, she'd become more than just a customer with a broken car. She'd become a temporary companion in the kind of work that mattered, a fellow traveler in the complicated journey of single parenthood. "What do I owe you for parts?" Sarah asked, though they both knew she'd already said she didn't have the money. "Nothing," Marcus said firmly. "But I want you to promise me something. Anything. When you get to the hospital, when you see Emma, you tell her that another Emma in Bakersfield was thinking about her tonight. Tell her that sometimes strangers become friends in the most unexpected ways." Sarah's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they looked like the kind of tears that came with gratitude instead of desperation. "I promise," she said. "And Marcus, when your Emma asks you tomorrow why you came home so late, you tell her that her daddy helped save another little girl's night. You tell her that kindness is contagious, and tonight it spread from Bakersfield all the way to Sacramento." 3 weeks later, Marcus was elbow-deep in the engine compartment of a 1998 Honda Civic when Danny Morales appeared in the doorway of his shop, holding a manila envelope and wearing the kind of expression that usually preceded bad news. "Marcus, we need to talk," Danny said, his voice carrying the weight of 30 years in the automotive parts business and all the difficult conversations that came with it. Marcus straightened up, wiping his hands on his ever-present red rag. The Honda belonged to Maria Santos, a single mother who cleaned offices at night to support her 3 kids. The transmission was slipping, and Marcus had already spent more time diagnosing the problem than he could afford. But Maria had the same look of quiet desperation that seemed to follow him like a shadow these days. "What's up, Danny?" Marcus asked, though he already suspected the answer. The envelope looked official, and official envelopes rarely contained good news for small business owners in Bakersfield. "Your account balance," Danny said, setting the envelope on Marcus's workbench next to Emma's latest chalk masterpiece, a drawing of a car with wings and a rainbow exhaust pipe. "It's getting out of hand, hermano. Corporate's been asking questions, and I'm running out of ways to explain why I keep extending credit to shops that can't pay their bills." Marcus opened the envelope and felt his stomach drop like a transmission falling out of an old Ford. The number at the bottom of the statement was worse than he'd feared. $4,847.63, nearly $5,000 in parts and supplies, accumulated over 6 months of choosing compassion over common sense. "I know it looks bad," Marcus started, but Danny held up a hand. "It doesn't look bad, Marcus. It is bad. Look, I've been covering for you because I believe in what you're doing here, but Southwest Auto Parts isn't a charity. I've got my own bills to pay, my own family to feed." Marcus stared at the statement, remembering every repair that had contributed to this number. Mrs. Patterson's ancient Buick that needed a fuel pump the same week her husband lost his job. The Rodriguez family's minivan that broke down the day before school started, leaving 3 kids with no way to get to their new schools. Tommy Williams's pickup truck that died right before harvest season, when he needed it most to get his equipment to the fields he leased outside of town. Each repair had seemed like the right thing to do at the time, a small act of kindness in a world that seemed increasingly short on both kindness and time. But kindness, Marcus was learning, had its own mathematics, and the numbers were finally catching up with him. "How long do I have?" Marcus asked. 30 days, Danny said, and his voice was genuinely sad. "After that, I have to cut you off completely. No more parts, no more supplies." "I'm sorry, Marcus, but I can't keep floating you indefinitely." After Danny left, Marcus sat alone in his shop, surrounded by the tools and equipment that represented 8 years of dreams and determination. The Honda Civic sat half-finished in the bay, its owner expecting a call tomorrow with an estimate she probably couldn't afford. On his desk, invoices from customers waited to be processed, each one representing someone who'd trusted him to solve their problems without always having the means to pay for solutions. His phone buzzed with a text from Emma. "Daddy, Mrs. Gutierrez is making tamales for dinner. Can you come home early tonight? I want to show you my new book about dragons." Marcus smiled despite everything. Emma had no idea that their small world was balanced on the edge of financial disaster. That every decision he made these days felt like choosing between immediate survival and long-term sustainability. She lived in the certainty that Daddy would always find a way to make things work. The dragons were real if you believed hard enough, and that tamales could cure almost any problem worth curing. The bell above his shop door chimed, and Marcus looked up to see a man in an expensive suit examining the prices posted on his wall. The stranger was tall and lean, with silver hair, and the kind of confidence that came with never having to check his bank balance before making a purchase. "Are you Marcus Rivera?" the man asked, extending a manicured hand. "I'm James Wellington, from Wellington & Associates. We spoke briefly on the phone last month." Marcus remembered the call. Something about a business opportunity, though he'd been too busy at the time to pay close attention. "Right, yes. What can I do for you, Mr. Wellington?" Wellington looked around the shop with the appraising eye of someone who saw everything in terms of potential profit. "I represent a group of investors who are interested in acquiring small automotive repair businesses in this region. We've been watching your operation, and we think Rivera's Auto Repair would be an excellent addition to our portfolio." "You want to buy my shop?" "We want to buy your location, your customer base, and your reputation," Wellington corrected. "You've built something valuable here, Marcus. People trust you, they recommend you to their friends and family. That kind of goodwill is worth more than the sum of your assets." Wellington opened his briefcase and withdrew a folder thick with legal documents. "We're prepared to offer you $300,000 for your business. Cash." Close in 30 days. The number hit Marcus like a physical blow. $300,000 would solve every financial problem he'd ever had, would give Emma opportunities he'd only dreamed of providing. College fund, new apartment, maybe even a house with a yard where she could plant the garden she'd been talking about since spring. What would happen to my customers? Marcus asked. We'd convert this location into a Wellington Quick Lube franchise, Wellington explained. 15-minute oil changes, basic maintenance, high-volume service. Much more efficient than the current model. And the people who can't afford Quick Lube prices? Wellington shrugged, the gesture of a man who'd never had to choose between fixing his car and feeding his family. There are other shops in town. Competition is healthy for the market. Marcus thought about Maria Santos, waiting for news about her Honda's transmission. About the elderly couples who brought their cars to him because they trusted him not to sell them repairs they didn't need. About the young families who stretched their budgets thin and paid him in installments because he was the only mechanic in town who understood that transportation wasn't a luxury. It was survival. I need some time to think about it, Marcus said. Of course, Wellington replied, leaving the folder on the workbench. But don't think too long. Opportunities like this don't come around often, especially for businesses with your current debt-to-asset ratio. The casual mention of his financial situation sent a chill down Marcus's spine. Wellington and Associates had done their homework, had looked beneath the surface of Rivera's auto repair, and seen the cracks that Marcus had been trying so hard to hide. That evening, as Marcus shared tamales with Emma and Mrs. Gutierrez, his daughter chattered excitedly about her new book. The dragon in the story is different, Daddy, Emma explained, holding up a picture of a creature that looked more like a wise old grandfather than a fearsome beast. He doesn't breathe fire to scare people. He breathes starlight to help them find their way home when they're lost. That's a good kind of dragon to be, Marcus said, though his mind was still wrestling with Wellington's offer. Mrs. Gutierrez says you've been working really late lately, Emma continued. Are there lots of broken cars right now? Something like that, Misha, Marcus said, not wanting to burden his daughter with adult worries. But don't worry about it, Daddy always figures things out. Later that night, after Emma was asleep and Mrs. Gutierrez had gone to bed, Marcus walked through the quiet streets of his neighborhood. Bakersfield at night was a different creature than Bakersfield during the day. Softer somehow, with the harsh edges smoothed by darkness and streetlights that turned ordinary corners into small stages for private dramas. He found himself standing outside the laundromat where Christina used to take their clothes every Saturday morning, back when they were young and broke and certain that love could overcome any practical obstacle. She used to joke that watching their clothes spin in the machines was like watching their future unfold, messy at first, but eventually clean and ready for whatever came next. His phone rang, startling him out of his memories. The caller ID showed a number he didn't recognize. "Hello?" he answered. "Marcus, it's Sarah Chen. I hope I'm not calling too late." Sarah's voice was like a bridge back to the night 3 weeks ago when the world had felt simpler, when the only problem was a broken radiator and the only solution was working through the night with kindness and determination. "Sarah? No, not too late at all. How's Emma? Is everything okay?" "Emma's wonderful," Sarah said, and Marcus could hear the smile in her voice. "She's back to being her normal, energetic self, driving the nurses crazy with questions about everything from why blood is red to whether robots dream about electric sheep." "That's great news," Marcus said, genuinely happy despite his own troubles. "I'm so glad she's feeling better." "That's actually why I'm calling," Sarah continued. "I wanted to thank you again for what you did that night. But more than that, I wanted to tell you about something that's been happening since I got back to Los Angeles." Marcus walked slowly toward his shop, listening to Sarah's voice carry across the miles between them. "I've been telling people about you," Sarah continued. "About what you did that night. About the kind of person you are. And the response has been incredible. Doctors, nurses, other parents whose children I've treated, everyone wants to know how they can help support what you're doing in Bakersfield." Marcus felt his chest tighten with a mixture of gratitude and embarrassment. "Sarah, you don't need to." "Let me finish," she interrupted gently. "I know you probably don't want charity, but this isn't charity, it's community. It's people recognizing that what you do matters, that your shop is more than just a business. It's a lifeline for people who need it most." Marcus had reached his shop and was standing in front of the gate, looking at the place he'd built from nothing but hope and stubbornness. In the streetlight, it looked smaller and more fragile than usual, like a house of cards that could be blown apart by the first strong wind. "There's something else," Sarah said. "I've been thinking about that night a lot, about how you just decided to help without knowing anything about me. And it made me realize that I've been living my life in a very narrow way, focused on my career and my own family, but not really connected to anything bigger." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I want to do more. I want to find ways to help people the way you helped me, and I think I might have found a way to start." Over the next 20 minutes, Sarah outlined an idea that was both simple and revolutionary. She wanted to create a network of professionals, doctors, lawyers, business owners, people with resources and skills, who could support small businesses like Marcus's that serve their communities with compassion rather than just profit. "Think of it like a modern version of barn raising," Sarah explained. "When someone in the community needs help, everyone comes together to make it happen. Except instead of building barns, we're building bridges between people who need help and people who can provide it." "It sounds amazing," Marcus said, "but I'm not sure how something like that would work in practice." "That's what I want to figure out," Sarah said. "And I want to start with you, with Rivera's Auto Repair. I want to prove that this kind of community support can work, that businesses can thrive while still putting people before profit." Marcus felt a spark of hope that he hadn't experienced in months, but years of struggle had taught him to be cautious about solutions that seemed too good to be true. "What would that look like?" "I'm not entirely sure yet," Sarah admitted. "But I think it starts with telling your story, the real story of what you do and why you do it. People need to know that places like Rivera's Auto Repair exist, that there are still people in the world who believe that kindness is more valuable than quarterly profit margins." After they hung up, Marcus sat in his shop office, staring at Wellington's offer folder next to Emma's dragon drawing. $300,000 represented security, stability, the kind of future that responsible fathers were supposed to provide for their children. But it also represented the end of everything he'd built, the destruction of the small corner of the world where people's cars got fixed regardless of their ability to pay. The next morning brought a cascade of problems that seemed designed to test his resolve. Maria Santos called to say she couldn't afford the transmission work on her Honda and would have to find another solution. The coffee shop across the street posted a notice that they were closing after 15 years because their rent had tripled. And Marcus discovered that his own landlord was considering selling the building to a developer who wanted to turn the entire block into upscale condominiums. "It's nothing personal," his landlord Jerry Kowalski explained during an uncomfortable conversation in the shop's waiting area. "But the city's changing, property values are going up, and I've got to think about my retirement. The developer's offering me enough money to buy a nice place in Arizona and never worry about property taxes again." "How long do I have?" Marcus asked, feeling like he was living the same conversation he'd had with Danny about parts credit. 6 months, maybe less," Jerry said. "I haven't signed anything yet, but the offer's too good to ignore indefinitely." As Jerry left, Marcus noticed Emma's latest chalk drawing on the concrete floor near the office door. This one showed 2 dragons working together to fix a car, their starlight breath illuminating the engine compartment while a little girl watched from the side, clapping her hands with joy. The symbolism wasn't lost on him. Emma believed in dragons that helped instead of destroyed, in worlds where problems got solved through cooperation and magic. But Marcus was learning that adult problems required adult solutions, and magic was in short supply in the automotive repair business. Over the next week, the pressure intensified from multiple directions. Danny called twice to remind him about the 30-day deadline for his parts account. Wellington called to ask if he'd had time to consider the buyout offer. Jerry stopped by to mention that the developer was getting impatient and might withdraw his offer if Jerry didn't make a decision soon. Meanwhile, Marcus's customer base seemed to be caught in their own web of financial struggles. The Ramirez family brought in their minivan with a dead battery but couldn't afford a new one until payday. Old Mr. Thompson needed new tires for his pickup truck, but was waiting for his Social Security check to arrive. The young couple who'd bought the house at the end of Marcus's street needed brake work on their sedan, but were already stretched thin from moving expenses. Each customer represented a choice between immediate payment and long-term relationship, between business survival and community service. Marcus found himself extending more credit, accepting more payment plans, making more repairs that his accountant would have called, quote, economically unsustainable. The breaking point came on a Thursday afternoon when Emma's school called to say she'd fallen on the playground and needed to be picked up. Marcus was in the middle of diagnosing a complex electrical problem on a customer's truck, but he dropped everything and drove to Eastwood Elementary with his heart hammering against his ribs. Emma was sitting in the nurse's office with a bandaged knee and tear-streaked cheeks, looking smaller and more fragile than Marcus had seen her since the dark days after Christina died. "What happened, Mija?" he asked, kneeling beside her chair and checking the bandage with gentle fingers. "I was playing dragons with Ashley and Miguel," Emma explained, her voice still shaky with leftover tears. "I was the good dragon who helps people, and I was flying really fast to save someone, but I tripped and scraped my knee really bad." The nurse, Mrs. Patterson, gave Marcus a sympathetic smile. "It's just a scrape, nothing serious." But she was pretty shaken up, and she kept asking for her daddy. As Marcus carried Emma to his truck, she wrapped her arms around his neck and whispered, "Daddy, do you think dragons ever get scared when they're trying to help people?" The question hit him harder than it should have. "I think even dragons get scared sometimes, Emma, but they help people anyway because that's what makes them heroes. Even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." That evening, as Marcus tucked Emma into bed, she asked the question he'd been dreading. "Daddy, are we poor?" Marcus sat on the edge of her bed, trying to find words that were honest without being frightening. "What makes you ask that, Mija?" "Some kids at school were talking about whose families have lots of money and whose families don't," Emma said. "And I started thinking about how we always eat dinner at Mrs. Gutierrez's house, and how our apartment is really small, and how you always work really late even though you don't like being away from me." Marcus felt something break inside his chest, some protective wall he'd built to keep his daughter's childhood separate from his adult worries. "We have everything we need," he said carefully. "We have each other. We have Mrs. Gutierrez who loves us. We have our home and your school and—" "But we don't have lots of money," Emma interrupted. "It's okay, Daddy. I just wanted to know. Does that worry you?" Emma considered this with the serious expression she wore when thinking about important things. "A little," she admitted. "But mostly it makes me proud." "Proud?" "Because you help people even when we don't have lots of money," Emma explained. "That's what real dragons do. They share their starlight even when they don't have very much to share." Marcus kissed his daughter's forehead and turned off her light, but her words followed him into his own sleepless night. She was 6 years old and already understood something about sacrifice and service that many adults never learned. She saw her father's struggles and chose to interpret them as heroism rather than hardship. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Marcus was opening the shop when a police car pulled into his parking lot, and Officer Rebecca Martinez stepped out wearing an expression that was part official business, part personal concern. "Morning, Marcus," she said. "Got a minute to talk?" Rebecca had been bringing her patrol car to Marcus for maintenance for 3 years, ever since the city had started contracting with local shops instead of maintaining their own fleet. She was also a single mother, raising twin boys while working night shifts and weekend overtime. "What's up, Rebecca?" Marcus asked, though he suspected this wasn't a social call. "I heard through the grapevine that Wellington and Associates has been sniffing around your shop," Rebecca said. "I wanted to give you a heads up about what that might mean for the neighborhood." Over the next 20 minutes, Rebecca painted a picture that made Marcus's stomach turn. Wellington and Associates wasn't just buying small businesses. They were systematically dismantling the infrastructure that made communities like this one function. They'd already purchased 3 other auto repair shops in Bakersfield, converting them all to high-volume, low-service operations that served customers with disposable income while leaving everyone else to fend for themselves. "It's not just car repair," Rebecca explained. "They've bought the corner market where Mrs. Chen used to cash checks for people without bank accounts. They bought the electronics repair shop where kids could get their phones fixed for $20 instead of having to buy new ones. They're turning this whole area into a place where you need perfect credit and a steady paycheck just to survive." "What about the city?" Marcus asked. "Isn't there anything local government can do?" Rebecca laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Half the city council thinks Wellington's development plans are exactly what Bakersfield needs to attract a better class of resident. They see gentrification as progress, and they don't much care what happens to the people who get priced out in the process." As Rebecca drove away, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. This wasn't just about his business anymore. It was about the entire ecosystem of small shops and services that made it possible for working-class families to live in this neighborhood. Rivera's auto repair was just one small piece of a larger puzzle, but sometimes one missing piece could cause the whole picture to fall apart. The irony wasn't lost on him. Sarah Chen was trying to build a network of support to help businesses like his survive and thrive, while Wellington and Associates was systematically destroying the very communities that such businesses served. It was kindness versus capitalism, played out on the small stage of Bakersfield's East Side. That afternoon, Marcus made a decision that his practical mind screamed against, but his heart demanded. He called Wellington's office and left a message declining their buyout offer. Then he called Danny Morales and arranged a payment plan that would allow him to keep his parts account current, even if it meant working 7 days a week for the foreseeable future. Finally, he called Sarah Chen. "I want to try," he told her. "I want to see if your idea can work, if there's really a way to build the kind of community you're talking about. But I need you to know that this isn't just about saving my business anymore. It's about saving a whole way of life that's disappearing one shop at a time." "I understand," Sarah said. "And Marcus? I think you're about to discover that you have more allies than you realize. Sometimes it just takes one person willing to stand up and fight for what matters." As Marcus hung up the phone, Emma burst through the shop door with Mrs. Gutierrez trailing behind her, both of them carrying paper bags that smelled like fresh-baked cookies. "Daddy," Emma called out, "Mrs. Gutierrez and I made cookies for all your customers. She says when people are having hard times, sometimes cookies help them remember that good things still exist." Marcus looked at his daughter, flour still dusting her dark hair, her face bright with the joy of giving. She was 6 years old and already understood that the best response to hardship was to offer whatever sweetness you could spare. "That's perfect, mija," he said, lifting her up for a hug that lasted longer than usual. That's exactly what dragons would do. 2 weeks after declining Wellington's offer, Marcus discovered that small acts of kindness could multiply in ways that defied conventional mathematics. It started with a phone call on a Monday morning that would have seemed routine if not for the tremor of excitement in Sarah Chen's voice. "Marcus, you need to see something," she said without preamble. "Check your email, right now." Marcus wiped his hands on his shop rag and opened his laptop, a 5-year-old machine that took its sweet time loading anything more complex than a basic text document. When his inbox finally appeared, he found an email with the subject line, "The mechanic who fixes more than cars, going viral." The message contained a link to a video that had been posted on social media 3 days earlier. As Marcus clicked play, he saw his own shop appear on screen, followed by an image of Sarah's BMW on that October night, then a photo of Emma grinning in her hospital bed. But this wasn't just any video. The narrator was Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a prominent pediatric surgeon at Children's Hospital Los Angeles and, as it turned out, one of Sarah's closest friends and colleagues. 3 weeks ago, my colleague Dr. Sarah Chen was driving through the night to reach her daughter in a Sacramento hospital. Dr. Walsh began, her voice carrying the authority that came with years of delivering both good news and devastating diagnoses to anxious families. When her car broke down in Bakersfield at nearly 8 p.m., she thought her worst nightmare was coming true. Instead, she met a man who proved that heroes don't always wear scrubs or carry stethoscopes. The video continued with Dr. Walsh recounting the story of that night, but with details that Marcus hadn't realized Sarah knew. Details about Emma's chalk drawings on the shop floor, about the late notices on his desk, about the way he'd worked through the night not just to fix a car, but to reunite a mother with her child. Marcus Rivera spent his own money on parts, worked for 6 hours without pay, and sent Dr. Chen on her way with nothing more than a promise to help another child in need, Dr. Walsh continued. When we started investigating, we discovered that this wasn't an isolated incident. Rivera's auto repair has become a lifeline for working families in Bakersfield, a place where people's transportation needs are met with compassion rather than exploitation. The video included testimonials from Marcus's customers, people he'd helped over the years who had somehow been tracked down and interviewed. Maria Santos spoke about the transmission work he'd done on payment plans. The Ramirez family talked about the Christmas morning when their car wouldn't start. and Marcus had driven to their house to fix it for free because Santa's helpers shouldn't be stranded. Old Mr. Thompson described how Marcus had not only fixed his truck, but had driven him to medical appointments when the vehicle was in the shop. What makes this story remarkable, Dr. Walsh concluded, isn't just one man's kindness. It's the reminder that in a world increasingly dominated by corporate efficiency and profit margins, there are still places where human dignity matters more than the bottom line. Marcus Rivera isn't just fixing cars. He's fixing the social fabric of his community, one family at a time. The video had been viewed 847,000 times in 3 days, shared across multiple platforms, and had generated thousands of comments from people sharing their own stories of unexpected kindness. Marcus stared at the screen in disbelief, his phone buzzing with notifications as more and more people discovered the video. Sarah called back within minutes. "Are you seeing this?" she asked, her voice barely containing her excitement. "I don't understand," Marcus said. "How did all these people know about what we do here?" "That's what I'm calling to tell you," Sarah said. "Jennifer didn't just make this video on a whim. She spent 2 weeks investigating your business, talking to your customers, researching your impact on the community, and Marcus, what she found was extraordinary." Over the next hour, Sarah explained how Dr. Walsh's investigation had revealed the broader scope of Marcus's informal support network. Without realizing it, he had created what sociologists called a resilience hub, a single point of stability that allowed entire families to maintain their footing in an increasingly unstable economy. "Your shop records show that over the past 3 years you've provided more than $60,000 in unpaid labor and discounted parts," Sarah continued. "But the economic impact goes far beyond that. The families you've helped have been able to keep their jobs, continue their education, maintain their housing stability. You've essentially been providing invisible infrastructure that the formal economy doesn't account for." Marcus felt overwhelmed by the implications. He'd never thought of his work in such analytical terms. He just fixed cars for people who needed cars fixed, whether they could pay full price or not. The idea that this simple approach could have measurable community impact seemed almost impossible to believe. "There's more," Sarah said. "The video has caught the attention of some people who want to help. Real help, not just social media likes and shares." Within hours of their conversation, Marcus's phone began ringing with calls from strangers who wanted to support Rivera's auto repair. A retired engineer from Sacramento offered to volunteer his time to help with complex diagnostic work. A parts supplier in Fresno said he'd been looking for a shop to partner with on community service projects. 3 different automotive schools called to ask if Marcus would accept intern mechanics who needed real-world experience. But the most surprising call came from Dr. James Harrison, chief of pediatric surgery at UC Davis Medical Center, where Sarah's daughter Emma had been treated. "Mr. Rivera," Dr. Harrison said, his voice carrying the measured authority of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions, "I've been following the story about what you did for Dr. Chen, and I wanted to reach out personally to discuss something that might interest you." Dr. Harrison explained that UC Davis had been working on a pilot program to address what medical professionals called social determinants of health, the non-medical factors that influenced patient outcomes. Transportation was a major barrier for many families seeking pediatric care, and the hospital had been looking for community partners who understood both the technical and human sides of the problem. "We'd like to propose a partnership," Dr. Harrison continued. UC Davis would provide funding for a program that would allow Rivera's Auto Repair to serve as a certified service center for families of our pediatric patients. You'd receive payment for parts and labor, plus additional compensation for the expedited service that medical situations often require. Marcus felt his heart racing as Dr. Harrison outlined the details. The partnership would provide steady income, official recognition, and the resources to serve more families without sacrificing his own financial stability. It was everything he'd dreamed of but had never thought to ask for. "There's one more thing," Dr. Harrison said. "Dr. Chen has recommended that we consider expanding this model to other communities throughout California. If the pilot program is successful, you might find yourself helping to design a statewide network of community-focused auto repair shops." After Dr. Harrison hung up, Marcus sat alone in his shop, trying to process the idea that his small corner of Bakersfield might become a model for something much larger. Through the window, he could see Emma playing in the small courtyard behind Mrs. Gutierrez's bakery, her laughter carrying across the afternoon air like music from a world where everything was still possible. The next few days brought a parade of visitors to Rivera's auto repair. Reporters from the local newspaper wanted to interview Marcus about his approach to business. A documentary filmmaker from Los Angeles asked permission to follow him for a week to capture the daily reality of community-focused commerce. Students from Cal State Bakersfield's business program requested internships, wanting to study what they called alternative economic models. But the most meaningful visitor was Rebecca Martinez, who stopped by after her shift with news that Marcus wasn't sure how to interpret. "The city council is calling an emergency session next week," Rebecca told him, settling into the chair across from his desk with the weary posture of someone who'd seen too much bureaucracy in action. "Wellington and Associates is pushing for a fast-track approval on their development project. They want to buy up this entire block before the media attention dies down." Marcus felt his stomach drop. "Can they do that?" "Legally? Probably," Rebecca said. "But there's been pushback. The video about your shop has generated a lot of community discussion about what kind of development we actually want in Bakersfield. Some council members are starting to ask questions about whether Wellington's projects really benefit the people who already live here." "What kind of questions?" "Questions about affordable housing requirements, about preserving existing businesses, about whether we want to become another city where working families can't afford to live," Rebecca explained. "Your story has become a symbol for people who think development should strengthen communities rather than replace them." That evening, Marcus attended his first city council meeting in 8 years. The community center was packed beyond capacity, with people standing along the walls and spilling out into the hallway. He recognized many faces from his customer base, but there were also strangers, young professionals, college students, elderly residents who remembered when Bakersfield had been a different kind of place. Wellington's representative, a polished lawyer named David Sterling, presented a vision of Bakersfield's future that sounded like it had been designed by a committee of real estate developers and corporate consultants. New shopping centers, upscale housing developments, franchise restaurants, and chain stores that would bring economic vitality and modern conveniences to an area that had been underutilized for too long. "The proposed development will create jobs, increase property values, and attract the kind of businesses that successful cities need to thrive," Sterling argued, clicking through a PowerPoint presentation full of architectural renderings that looked like they could have been for any suburban development in America. When Marcus was invited to speak, he felt the weight of 300 pairs of eyes as he walked to the podium. Public speaking had never been his strength. He was much better with wrenches than with words. But as he looked out at the crowd, he saw Emma sitting in the front row with Mrs. Gutierrez, giving him an encouraging thumbs up. "I'm not good at speeches," Marcus began, his voice echoing through the community center's sound system. "But I know something about fixing things that are broken. And I think our community isn't broken. It just needs people who are willing to invest in what's already here instead of tearing it down to build something else." He talked about Maria Santos, who had been able to keep her job cleaning offices because her Honda was reliable. About the Ramirez family, whose kids had perfect attendance at school because their minivan started every morning. About old Mr. Thompson, who maintained his independence because his truck could get him to the grocery store and the doctor's office. "These aren't just cars," Marcus said, finding his rhythm as he spoke. "They're lifelines. They're the difference between a family thriving and a family falling apart. And when you replace businesses that understand this with businesses that only care about profit margins, you're not improving the community. You're destroying it." The applause that followed was sustained and genuine, the kind of response that came from people who recognized their own experiences in someone else's words. But Marcus knew that applause didn't change zoning laws or alter economic incentives. The real battle would be fought in council chambers and planning meetings, with lawyers and lobbyists who understood how to translate community sentiment into binding policy. Over the next week, Marcus found himself at the center of a community organizing effort that was both exhilarating and exhausting. Sarah Chen flew in from Los Angeles to speak at a town hall meeting about the economic impact of community-focused businesses. Dr. Harrison sent a letter to the city council outlining UC Davis's plans to partner with Rivera's auto repair and explaining how the proposed development would interfere with their pilot program. Local business owners who had previously competed with each other began coordinating their response to Wellington's expansion plans. The owner of the corner market started a petition to preserve locally owned and operated zoning requirements. The manager of the credit union offered financial literacy classes to help people understand how predatory lending practices had made working families vulnerable to displacement. Even Emma got involved, in her own 6-year-old way. She organized her classmates to make drawings of their neighborhood, showing all the places where their families went for necessities: the auto repair shop, the corner market, the laundromat, the small clinic where Dr. Rodriguez treated everyone regardless of their insurance status. The drawings were displayed at the library with a sign that read, "This is our community, kids, vision for the future." But the most powerful support came from an unexpected source. 3 days before the council's final vote on Wellington's development proposal, Marcus received a call from a number he didn't recognize. "Is this Marcus Rivera?" the caller asked, her voice carrying a slight accent that Marcus couldn't immediately place. "Yes, this is Marcus." "Mr. Rivera, my name is Dr. Elena Vasquez, and I'm the Chief Administrator for the California Department of Public Health. I'm calling because we've been following the situation in Bakersfield with great interest." Dr. Vasquez explained that the state had been studying the relationship between community infrastructure and public health outcomes, particularly in rural and semi-rural areas like Bakersfield. Marcus's shop had been identified as what researchers called a, quote, critical access point, a business that provided essential services to populations that might otherwise be unable to access them. "We'd like to designate Rivera's auto repair as a community health asset," Dr. Vasquez continued. "This is a new classification that provides state-level protection for businesses that serve essential community functions. It would make it much more difficult for developers to acquire your property through eminent domain or other aggressive tactics. The designation would also come with benefits, tax incentives, grants for equipment upgrades, and priority access to state contracts for vehicle maintenance. But more importantly, it would send a signal that what Marcus had built was valued by institutions larger than Wellington and Associates." "Why are you doing this?" Marcus asked. "Because people like you are becoming extinct," Dr. Vasquez said bluntly. "Small business owners who see their role as serving their community rather than maximizing profit. The state has a vested interest in preserving these kinds of businesses because they provide social infrastructure that we can't replace with government programs." The night before the city council vote, Marcus couldn't sleep. He walked through his shop in the darkness, running his hands over the tools and equipment that had become extensions of his own capabilities. Each wrench and socket had a history. Each machine had helped solve problems that were about much more than automotive repair. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah Chen: "Whatever happens tomorrow, you've already won. You've shown people that another way of doing business is possible, and that's going to inspire others long after this fight is over." Marcus smiled, thinking about the community that had rallied around his small shop. 6 months ago, he'd been a single father trying to keep his business afloat one repair at a time. Now he was part of a movement that was questioning fundamental assumptions about how communities should develop and who should benefit from economic growth. Emma was right about dragons, he thought. The good ones didn't breathe fire to destroy. They breathed starlight to help people find their way home. And sometimes, if you were lucky, you discovered that you weren't the only dragon in the sky. The Bakersfield City Council chambers had never seen anything like the crowd that gathered on the morning of the final vote. By 8 a.m., 3 hours before the meeting was scheduled to begin, people were already lined up outside the building, holding signs that read "Community over Profit" and "Keep Bakersfield Local." Marcus arrived to find Emma and Mrs. Gutierrez near the front of the line, his daughter wearing a handmade t-shirt that proclaimed "My daddy is a real dragon" in glittery purple letters. "Misha, you didn't have to come," Marcus said, kneeling down to Emma's level. "This is grown-up business, and it might be really boring." Emma shook her head with the serious expression she wore when correcting adult misconceptions. "Dragons always show up when other dragons need help," she said. "That's what makes them a family." As the morning progressed, the crowd continued to grow. Sarah Chen arrived with Dr. Harrison and 3 other physicians from UC Davis, all wearing medical scrubs to emphasize their professional stake in the outcome. Rebecca Martinez came in uniform, flanked by 2 other officers who lived in the neighborhood and understood what Wellington's development would mean for the families they served. But the most surprising arrival was a bus from Los Angeles, carrying 25 automotive students from a technical college, along with their instructor, Professor Michael Torres. "We drove all night," Professor Torres explained to Marcus as the students filed into the building. "When we heard about what you're doing here, we realized this isn't just about one shop in Bakersfield. This is about the future of our entire profession." The students represented a new generation of mechanics who had been trained to see automotive repair as a technical skill rather than a community service. But the story of Rivera's auto repair had sparked discussions in their classrooms about the role they wanted to play in their own communities, about whether success was measured only in profit margins or also in the lives they could improve. When the council meeting finally began, the chamber was so packed that fire department officials had to restrict entry for safety reasons. Council member Patricia Hendricks, a longtime advocate for small business development, called for public comment on Wellington's proposal, and the testimony that followed painted two completely different visions of Bakersfield's future. Wellington supporters spoke about economic growth, job creation, and the need to modernize a city that had been left behind by regional development. They presented studies showing increased property values, tax revenue projections, and comparisons to successful development projects in similar cities. But the opposition testimony was more personal and more powerful. Maria Santos spoke about how reliable transportation had allowed her to advance from cleaning offices to managing a janitorial service. The Ramirez family's oldest daughter, now 16, talked about her plans to become an automotive engineer and how Marcus had inspired her to see mechanical work as a pathway to helping others. Old Mr. Thompson, wearing his best suit and leaning heavily on a wooden cane, delivered what many would later call the most moving testimony of the day. "I'm 83 years old," he began, his voice steady despite his age. "I've lived in Bakersfield for 60 years, and I've seen this city change in ways both good and bad. But I want to tell you about what real community looks like." He described the morning when his pickup truck wouldn't start and he'd missed a crucial medical appointment, how Marcus had not only fixed the vehicle but had driven him to the doctor's office personally and waited 3 hours to drive him home. "That young man didn't see dollar signs when he looked at me," Mr. Thompson continued. "He saw a neighbor who needed help. And that's what we're really voting on today, whether we want a city full of neighbors or a city full of customers." When it was Marcus's turn to speak, he felt the weight of everyone's expectations pressing down on him like atmospheric pressure before a storm. He'd prepared remarks, but standing at the podium looking out at the faces of people whose lives had intersected with his in small but meaningful ways, he found himself speaking from his heart instead of his notes. "6 years ago, my wife died of cancer," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the packed chamber. "Emma was 2 years old, and I was a single father trying to figure out how to rebuild our lives from scratch. This community saved us, not through big gestures or formal programs, but through small acts of kindness from people who barely knew us." He talked about Mrs. Gutierrez, who had offered to watch Emma when childcare fell through, about customers who had recommended his shop to friends and family, building his business one referral at a time, about the network of mutual support that had grown organically around Rivera's auto repair, not because anyone had planned it, but because people took care of each other when institutions failed to do so. "What Wellington and Associates is proposing isn't just development," Marcus concluded. "It's replacement. They want to replace community with commerce, relationships with transactions, neighbors with customers. And once that replacement happens, you can't go back. You can't rebuild trust with a quarterly profit report or create belonging with a marketing campaign." The vote, when it finally came, was closer than anyone had expected. 4 council members in favor of Wellington's proposal, 3 opposed. But the deciding vote came from Council Member Robert Chen, no relation to Sarah, who had been considered a likely supporter of the development project. "I've listened to 12 hours of testimony over the past month," Chen said, his voice reflecting the difficulty of the decision he was about to make. "And I keep coming back to one question: what kind of city do we want to be? Do we want to be a place that prioritizes growth over people, efficiency over community, profit over purpose?" Chen's vote against the Wellington proposal sent a ripple of surprise through the chamber, followed by sustained applause that took several minutes for the council chair to quiet. But the victory celebration was tempered by the knowledge that this was just one battle in a larger war. Wellington and Associates announced their intention to appeal the decision, and similar development pressures were building in communities throughout California and beyond. Over the following weeks, Marcus found himself at the center of a movement that was spreading far beyond Bakersfield. The video about Rivera's auto repair had been viewed more than 3 million times, and Marcus was receiving calls from business owners, community organizers, and local officials in dozens of cities who wanted to understand how to replicate what he'd built. The UC Davis partnership became a reality in January, providing steady income and official recognition for the community service work that Rivera's auto repair had been doing informally for years. The program expanded to include partnerships with 3 other hospitals and 2 community health centers, creating a network of Sarah Chen kept her promise to build a broader support network, establishing the Community Infrastructure Foundation with funding from medical professionals, small business owners, and individuals who had been inspired by the Bakersfield story. The foundation provided low-interest loans, technical assistance, and marketing support to businesses that prioritized community service alongside financial sustainability. But perhaps the most meaningful change was the ripple effect that Marcus could see in his own neighborhood. The corner market expanded to include a small cafe where people gathered for coffee and conversation. The credit union launched a program to provide financial counseling and small business loans to residents who had been excluded from traditional banking. Dr. Rodriguez opened a second clinic location specifically to serve families who struggled with transportation to medical appointments. The transformation wasn't dramatic or immediate. It happened one relationship at a time, one small business decision at a time, one family's improved circumstances at a time. But by spring, Marcus could feel the difference in the air, like the way a garden changes when someone starts tending it with intention and care. Emma, now 7 years old and in 2nd grade, had become something of a celebrity at Eastwood Elementary. Her teacher, Ms. Rodriguez, had incorporated the Rivera's auto repair story into a unit about community helpers. And Emma had proudly presented a project about My Dad the Dragon that included photos of customers whose lives had been touched by her father's work. "She talks about you constantly," Ms. Rodriguez told Marcus during a parent-teacher conference. Not in a boastful way, but with this deep understanding that helping people is what adults are supposed to do. It's remarkable for a child her age to have such a clear sense of purpose and values. Marcus felt a mixture of pride and concern. He wanted Emma to understand the importance of service and community, but he also wanted her to have the freedom to choose her own path without feeling burdened by his legacy. "What does she want to be when she grows up?" he asked. Ms. Rodriguez smiled. "Last week she said she wanted to be a heart mechanic, like Dr. Sarah, so she could fix people's hearts the way you fix people's cars. But when I asked her what that meant, she said she wanted to help families stay together when things get broken." The description made perfect sense to Marcus. Emma had grown up watching him solve problems that were about much more than automotive repair, and she'd internalized the idea that fixing things meant fixing lives, not just machines. By summer, Rivera's auto repair had become a destination for people from throughout California who wanted to see what community-focused business looked like in practice. Marcus found himself hosting delegations of small business owners, social workers, and even economists who were studying what they called alternative economic models. One particularly memorable visit came from Dr. James Morrison, an economics professor from Stanford University, who was researching the social impact of small businesses in rural communities. "What you've created here challenges some fundamental assumptions about market efficiency," Dr. Morrison explained, as Marcus showed him around the shop. "Traditional economic theory suggests that businesses should maximize profit and that market forces will naturally create optimal outcomes. But your model suggests that when businesses optimize for community benefit instead of pure profit, you can actually create more sustainable economic growth." Marcus wasn't sure he understood all the academic terminology, but he knew what he saw every day. Families who were more stable because their transportation was reliable, workers who could pursue better opportunities because they weren't constantly worried about car repairs, elderly residents who maintained their independence because someone understood that mobility was about dignity as much as convenience. "I don't know much about economic theory," Marcus told Dr. Morrison, "but I know that when you help people solve their immediate problems, they have more energy to work on their long-term goals. And when people in a community are working toward their goals, everyone benefits. Dr. Morrison spent 3 days documenting the operations at Rivera's auto repair, interviewing customers, and analyzing the business model. His resulting research paper, published in the Journal of Community Economics, would later be cited in dozens of studies about the relationship between social capital and economic development. But the most significant validation came from an unexpected source. In August, Marcus received a call from the White House Office of Rural Development informing him that Rivera's Auto Repair had been selected as one of 12 businesses nationwide to receive the Presidential Award for Community Innovation. This recognition is for businesses that demonstrate exceptional commitment to serving their communities while maintaining financial sustainability, the caller explained. You'll be invited to Washington, D.C. in October to receive the award and participate in a symposium on community-based economic development. Marcus had never been to Washington, D.C., and the idea of receiving a presidential award seemed surreal. But Emma was beside herself with excitement. "Daddy, you're going to meet the president," she exclaimed, bouncing around the shop like a rubber ball. "Can I come with you? I want to show him my drawings of dragons." The trip to Washington was unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. He found himself in conference rooms with policymakers, economists, and community development experts from around the country, all discussing how to replicate the kind of grassroots economic development that had emerged organically in Bakersfield. Emma came with him, of course, wearing her best dress and carrying a portfolio of her dragon drawings to share with anyone who would listen. At the White House ceremony, she sat in the front row with Mrs. Gutierrez, who had flown in for the occasion, both of them beaming with pride as Marcus shook hands with officials and accepted an award that recognized not just his individual efforts, but the entire community that had supported and amplified his work. The president's remarks that day focused on the importance of businesses that strengthen the social fabric of their communities while creating economic opportunity. But for Marcus, the most meaningful moment came during the reception afterward, when Emma approached the president and handed him one of her dragon drawings. "This is my daddy," she explained with the confidence that only 7-year-olds possessed. "He's a dragon who breathes starlight to help people find their way home. And he taught me that the best way to help people is to pay attention to what they really need, not just what they say they want." The president, clearly charmed by Emma's earnestness, knelt down to her level and studied the drawing carefully. "That's a very wise dragon," he said. "And it sounds like you've learned some very important lessons about helping others." "Everyone can be a dragon," Emma replied. "You just have to decide to share your starlight, instead of keeping it all for yourself." The exchange was photographed and later appeared in newspapers across the country, becoming one of the most widely shared images from the Community Development Symposium. But for Marcus, the real significance was seeing his daughter articulate values that they had never explicitly discussed, but that she had absorbed through years of watching him work. As autumn arrived in Bakersfield, Marcus reflected on how much had changed since that October night when Sarah Chen's BMW had broken down outside his shop. The business was more successful than it had ever been, but success was measured in more than financial terms. Rivera's Auto Repair had become a model for what small businesses could accomplish when they prioritized community over pure profit, and that model was being replicated in communities throughout the country. The Community Infrastructure Foundation had funded similar programs in 43 cities, creating a network of businesses that served as anchor points for working-class communities. The UC Davis partnership had expanded to include 5 other universities, all studying different aspects of community-based healthcare delivery. And the Presidential Award had brought national attention to the idea that economic development could strengthen communities rather than displacing them. But the changes weren't just institutional, they were personal. Marcus had discovered a sense of purpose that went beyond surviving as a single father and small business owner. He was part of something larger, a movement that was reshaping how people thought about the relationship between commerce and community. Emma, meanwhile, had grown into a confident, articulate child who understood that her family's story was connected to bigger questions about how society should work. She still drew pictures of dragons breathing starlight, but now her dragons were surrounded by communities of people helping each other, sharing resources, and building the kind of world where everyone had what they needed to thrive. That most profound change, though, was in Marcus himself. The fear and uncertainty that had dominated his thinking for years after Christina's death had been replaced by something that felt like hope, mixed with determination. He had learned that individual acts of kindness could multiply into community transformation, that small businesses could be vehicles for social change, and that the work of healing and repair extended far beyond the mechanical. As winter approached, Marcus began planning for the future with a confidence he hadn't felt since before Christina got sick. Rivera's auto repair would continue to serve its community, but it would also serve as a training ground for other mechanics who wanted to approach their work with the same community-focused philosophy. The Community Infrastructure Foundation was developing a certification program for community care mechanics, and Marcus would help design the curriculum. There were also personal plans. Mrs. Gutierrez had suggested that Marcus consider expanding his living situation, maybe buying a small house with a yard where Emma could plant the garden she'd been dreaming about for years. The financial stability provided by the UC Davis partnership made such dreams feel achievable rather than impossible. And there was Sarah Chen, who had become more than just the doctor whose car he'd fixed on a desperate night. Their friendship had deepened through months of collaboration on the Community Infrastructure Foundation, and Marcus found himself looking forward to her visits to Bakersfield with an anticipation that had nothing to do with business planning. "You know," Sarah said during one of their conversations, "Emma, my Emma, has been asking when she can meet Emma, your Emma. She wants to compare notes about having parents who help fix people." The idea of their daughters meeting, of their two families connecting in ways that went beyond the professional partnership that had brought them together, felt like another kind of healing, another kind of repair that went beyond the mechanical. 5 years later. The morning sun cast long shadows across the expanded Rivera's auto repair as 12-year-old Emma Rivera finished her inspection of the shop's newest addition, a fully equipped training bay where community college students learned the technical and social skills of community-focused automotive repair. Her clipboard held a checklist of items that needed attention before the day's first class, and she approached the task with the methodical precision of someone who had grown up understanding that details mattered. "Dad," she called across the shop floor, where Marcus was reviewing the day's schedule with his newest employee, Miguel Santos, Maria's son, who had graduated from the Community Mechanics Certification Program 6 months earlier. "The diagnostic computer in Bay 3 needs calibration, and we're running low on the hydraulic fluid for the lift." Marcus smiled at his daughter's competence. At 12, Emma had inherited her mother's gift for organization and her father's mechanical intuition, but she'd developed her own unique perspective on the intersection of technology and community service. She designed the inventory tracking system the shop now used, created a customer communication protocol that kept families informed about repair timelines, and had started a weekend program where high school students could earn community service credits by helping elderly customers with basic car maintenance. "Thanks, Mija," Marcus replied. "Can you call Danny's warehouse and ask them to deliver the hydraulic fluid by noon? The afternoon class will need that lift operational." The training program had become one of Rivera's auto repair's most successful innovations. Developed in partnership with Bakersfield Community College and funded through the Community Infrastructure Foundation, it graduated 24 certified community mechanics each year. These graduates went on to start their own community-focused shops, join established businesses that were transitioning to more service-oriented models, or work for the growing network of medical transportation programs that had emerged from the original UC Davis partnership. Miguel Santos represented everything the program was designed to accomplish. He'd grown up watching his mother struggle with car repairs that she couldn't afford, had seen firsthand how transportation problems could cascade into housing instability and job loss. But instead of viewing automotive repair as just another service industry, he'd learned to see it as a form of community infrastructure, as essential to neighborhood stability as reliable electricity or clean water. "Mr. Rivera," Miguel said, consulting his tablet, "Dr. Chen called this morning to confirm that the Sacramento site visit is still scheduled for Thursday. She wanted to make sure you had time to review the expansion proposal before the meeting." The Sacramento expansion represented the next phase of what had become known as the Bakersfield model, a systematic approach to community development that used small businesses as anchor points for broader social and economic stability. Sarah Chen, now director of the Community Infrastructure Foundation, had been working with UC Davis and the California Department of Public Health to establish similar programs in 12 cities throughout the state. The model had evolved far beyond Marcus's original vision. What had started as one mechanic helping stranded customers had become a comprehensive framework for community-responsive business development. The foundation now supported community pharmacies that provided medication management services, neighborhood hardware stores that offered basic home repair education, and small grocery stores that functioned as informal community centers and resource hubs. "Tell Dr. Chen that we'll be ready," Marcus said, "and remind her that Emma wants to present her research project about automotive technology and social equity." Emma's project, which she'd been working on for her 8th grade science fair, examined how access to reliable transportation affected educational outcomes in rural communities. She'd surveyed families served by Rivera's auto repair and similar businesses, documented correlations between car reliability and school attendance, and proposed policy recommendations for integrating transportation support into educational equity initiatives. At 12, she was already thinking about problems that professional researchers were just beginning to understand. But more importantly, she was developing the kind of analytical skills that could bridge the gap between individual kindness and systemic change. The shop door chimed, and old Mr. Thompson entered, moving more slowly than he had 5 years earlier, but still maintaining the independence that had been threatened when his truck broke down all those years ago. At 88, he'd become something of a neighborhood institution, a living reminder of what community support could accomplish over time. "Morning, Marcus," he said, settling into the chair that everyone now referred to as Mr. Thompson's spot. "I brought you something." He handed Marcus a newspaper clipping from the Los Angeles Times, dated 3 days earlier. The headline read, "From Broken Cars to Broken Systems, How One Mechanic's Approach is Reshaping Community Development Policy." The article was part of a series about innovative approaches to rural economic development, and it featured Rivera's auto repair as a case study in what economists were calling embedded social entrepreneurship, business models that generated profit while simultaneously strengthening community resilience. "They interviewed me for this article," Mr. Thompson said with obvious pride. "Told them about how you've been keeping my truck running for 8 years now, how you've never charged me more than I could afford, how you've become like family to me and to half the folks in this neighborhood." Marcus read the article, while Emma and Miguel continued their morning preparations. The journalist had done extensive research, documenting not just the direct services provided by Rivera's auto repair, but the broader economic impacts of the community-focused approach. Families served by the shop had higher rates of employment stability, educational achievement, and homeownership. The neighborhood around the shop had lower rates of displacement and gentrification, despite increasing property values throughout Bakersfield. But here's the really interesting part, the article continued. Rivera's success has inspired similar approaches in other industries. Community-focused pharmacies, hardware stores, and even technology repair shops are adopting what researchers call the Bakersfield model, prioritizing long-term community relationships over short-term profit maximization. The article included quotes from Dr. James Morrison, the Stanford economist who had first studied Rivera's auto repair 5 years earlier. His research had been instrumental in demonstrating that businesses could be both profitable and community-serving, that social responsibility and financial sustainability weren't mutually exclusive. "The Rivera model suggests that we've been thinking about business success in overly narrow terms," Dr. Morrison was quoted as saying. "When you measure success by community impact as well as profit margins, you discover that the two are often mutually reinforcing rather than competitive." 3 years later, the auditorium at UC Davis was packed beyond capacity as 15-year-old Emma Rivera stepped up to the podium to deliver the keynote address at the annual Community Infrastructure Foundation Symposium. She wore a navy blazer that made her look older than her years, but her eyes still held the curiosity and compassion that had characterized her since childhood. "My name is Emma Rivera," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the microphone system, "and I'm here to talk about something my dad taught me when I was 6 years old, that fixing things is about more than making them work. It's about making them work for everyone." The audience, a mix of business owners, policymakers, academics, and community organizers from across the country, leaned forward as Emma began to tell the story of Rivera's auto repair, but from her perspective as someone who had grown up watching individual acts of kindness transform into systemic change. "When people ask me what it was like to grow up in a community mechanic shop," she continued, "I tell them it was like getting a master class in problem solving. Not just the technical kind of problem solving, like figuring out why an engine won't start, but the human kind, like figuring out how to help families stay stable when everything else in their lives is falling apart. Emma's speech was the culmination of 3 years of advocacy work she'd been doing alongside her regular high school curriculum. She'd testified before the California State Senate about transportation equity, had co-authored a research paper with Dr. Sarah Chen about the health impacts of community-based automotive services, and had designed a mobile app that connected low-income families with community mechanics throughout the state. But her real influence came from her ability to articulate complex social and economic concepts in ways that made sense to people who weren't academics or policy experts. She spoke about community development in terms that honored both the technical expertise required to fix cars and the emotional intelligence required to serve families in crisis. The thing about being a community mechanic, Emma explained, is that you're not just fixing cars. You're fixing the connections between people and the opportunities they need to build better lives. When my dad repairs someone's car for free, he's not losing money. He's investing in the social infrastructure that makes our whole community stronger. In the audience, Marcus watched his daughter with a mixture of pride and amazement. At 15, she had developed into a confident public speaker and thoughtful advocate, but she'd also maintained the empathy and practical wisdom that had characterized her since childhood. She understood that individual kindness and systemic change weren't separate categories, but different scales of the same fundamental work. After her speech, Emma fielded questions from audience members who wanted to know how to replicate the Bakersfield model in their own communities. Her answers were thoughtful and specific, reflecting years of observation and analysis. "The most important thing to understand," she said in response to a question from a social worker in Portland, "is that you can't just copy what we did in Bakersfield and expect it to work somewhere else. Every community has different needs, different resources, different challenges. The Bakersfield model isn't a blueprint. It's a framework for paying attention to what your community actually needs and then figuring out how to provide it." 2 years later, the wedding took place in the courtyard behind Mrs. Gutierrez's bakery, now expanded to include a small event space that had become a popular venue for neighborhood celebrations. Marcus Rivera and Sarah Chen had chosen to marry in the place where their friendship had deepened over years of collaborative work, surrounded by the community that had supported and sustained both of their families. 17-year-old Emma Rivera served as maid of honor, while Sarah's daughter, Emma Chen, now 14, was a bridesmaid. The two Emmas had developed a close friendship that bridged the distance between Bakersfield and Los Angeles, bonding over their shared experience of having parents whose work connected individual service to broader social change. The ceremony was officiated by Dr. James Harrison from UC Davis, who had become a close friend of both families over the years of their professional partnership. In his remarks, he spoke about the way that some relationships grew out of crisis and evolved into something larger than either person could have created alone. Marcus and Sarah's relationship began with a broken radiator and a desperate night drive. Dr. Harrison said, addressing the gathering of family, friends, customers, and colleagues who had come to celebrate, "But it has become a partnership that has transformed how we think about the relationship between individual kindness and community development." The reception featured food from local businesses that had participated in the Community Infrastructure Foundation's programs over the years. Mrs. Gutierrez had prepared her famous tamales, the corner market provided fruit and vegetables from local farms, and the neighborhood cafe had contributed desserts made with ingredients grown in the community garden that Emma Rivera had finally convinced her father to help her plant. As the evening progressed, guests shared stories about how the Rivera-Chen partnership had influenced their own work and communities. A mechanic from Oregon described how he'd implemented the Bakersfield model in a logging town. A pediatric nurse from Texas talked about developing community-focused healthcare programs. A small business owner from Michigan explained how she'd restructured her hardware store to function as a neighborhood resource hub. But the most moving testimony came from Maria Santos, whose son Miguel was now managing the day-to-day operations of Rivera's auto repair, while Marcus focused on expanding the training programs. 15 years ago, my Honda broke down and I didn't have money for repairs, Maria said, her voice carrying across the quiet courtyard. Marcus could have turned me away, or he could have fixed my car and put me deeper in debt. Instead, he fixed my car and helped me understand that my transportation problems were connected to bigger issues about economic stability and community support. Maria had used that understanding to transform her own life, going from cleaning offices to managing a cleaning service that employed 12 people and provided benefits and job training to workers who had been excluded from the formal economy. "What Marcus taught me," she continued, "is that solving individual problems and solving systemic problems aren't different kinds of work, they're the same work at different scales. And what Sarah taught me is that you can use professional expertise to serve community needs instead of just maximizing profit." As the celebration continued into the evening, Marcus found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 7 years earlier, he'd been a struggling single father, trying to keep a small auto repair shop afloat while serving customers who couldn't always pay full price for services they desperately needed. Now he was part of a movement that had influenced policy at the state and federal levels, had inspired similar programs in hundreds of communities, and had demonstrated that businesses could be both profitable and community-serving. But more importantly, he was part of a family that extended far beyond his immediate household, to include the network of relationships that had grown around Rivera's auto repair. Emma Rivera, now a senior in high school and planning to study engineering and public policy at Stanford University, had become a national advocate for transportation equity and community-based economic development. She'd been accepted to college with a full scholarship funded by the Community Infrastructure Foundation, but she'd also been offered internships with think tanks, nonprofit organizations, and government agencies that wanted to learn from her unique perspective on the intersection of technology and social justice. "I'm going to study engineering," she'd told Marcus when discussing her college plans, "but not because I want to design better cars. I want to design better systems. Systems that connect people to opportunities, systems that make communities more resilient, systems that help families thrive instead of just survive." 10 years later. The documentary film premiered at the Sundance Film Festival on a snowy January evening, 10 years to the month after that first desperate phone call from Sarah Chen. Starlight Dragons, a decade of community innovation, traced the evolution of the Bakersfield model from a single act of kindness to a nationwide movement that had influenced everything from healthcare delivery to educational policy. Emma Rivera, now 27 and completing her PhD in engineering and public policy at Stanford, served as one of the film's executive producers. She'd spent 2 years working with the filmmakers to ensure that the documentary accurately represented both the individual stories and the systemic changes that had emerged from her father's work. The film opened with footage from that long-ago city council meeting where the community had successfully opposed Wellington and Associates' development proposal. The contrast between that packed, passionate gathering and the quiet efficiency of Rivera's auto repair on a typical Tuesday morning illustrated how grassroots organizing and daily service work were different expressions of the same fundamental commitment to community. But the heart of the documentary was the interviews with people whose lives had been touched by the community infrastructure programs that had grown out of the Bakersfield model. A teacher in Montana whose students had better attendance because their families had reliable transportation. A nurse in Florida whose patients had improved health outcomes because they could get to medical appointments. A small business owner in Ohio whose neighborhood had resisted gentrification because local businesses prioritized community stability over rapid growth. The film's title came from the drawings that 12-year-old Emma had made years earlier, images of dragons breathing starlight to help people find their way home. But, as the documentary made clear, the real dragons were ordinary people who had learned to use their skills and resources to strengthen their communities, rather than just advancing their individual interests. Marcus, now 52, and serving as director of the National Community Infrastructure Institute, watched the premiere with a mixture of pride and amazement. The institute, based in Sacramento and funded through a combination of federal grants and private donations, provided technical assistance and financial support to communities that wanted to implement their own versions of the Bakersfield model. Over the past decade, the institute had helped establish community-focused businesses in 347 cities across 41 states. Each program was adapted to local needs and resources, but all shared the same fundamental approach: using small businesses as anchor points for broader community development, measuring success by community impact as well as financial sustainability, and training business owners to see themselves as community infrastructure rather than just service providers. "What we've learned," Marcus explained to a reporter after the premiere, "is that the Bakersfield model isn't really about automotive repair. It's about creating businesses that serve as bridges between individual need and community resources. The specific industry doesn't matter as much as the commitment to putting community stability ahead of profit maximization." Sarah Chen, now in her 50s and serving as the Community Infrastructure Foundation's chief medical officer, had spent the past decade documenting the health impacts of community-focused business development. Her research had shown that neighborhoods with active community infrastructure programs had significantly better outcomes in areas ranging from childhood obesity to mental health to management of chronic diseases. What Marcus discovered by accident, she explained in her interview for the documentary, is that social determinants of health include not just access to health care, but access to the kind of community support that helps families maintain stability during times of crisis. When people know they can get their car fixed affordably, when they trust their mechanic not to take advantage of their desperation, when they're part of a community that sees transportation as a shared concern rather than an individual responsibility, all of that contributes to better health outcomes. The most powerful moment in the documentary came during an interview with Emma Rivera herself, conducted in the original bay of Rivera's auto repair, where her father had first fixed Sarah Chen's BMW years earlier. Now a respected researcher and advocate, she spoke with the authority of someone who had grown up watching individual kindness transform into systemic change. "People sometimes ask me if I'm going to take over my dad's business," she said, standing next to the workbench where she'd done homework as a child. "But the truth is, we've all taken it over. The community infrastructure movement isn't owned by any one person or organization. It belongs to everyone who believes that businesses should strengthen communities rather than extract value from them." Emma had indeed chosen a different path than automotive repair, but her work as an engineer and policy researcher was deeply connected to the lessons she'd learned growing up in her father's shop. She'd designed transportation systems for 3 major cities, had consulted with the Federal Department of Transportation on rural mobility initiatives, and had co-authored legislation that provided federal funding for community infrastructure programs. But her most significant contribution was theoretical, a framework for understanding how individual acts of service could be scaled into systematic social change without losing their essential human character. Her doctoral dissertation, From Starlight to Systems: Designing Community-Responsive Infrastructure, had become required reading in graduate programs ranging from public policy to business administration to social work. "The question isn't whether we can afford to run businesses that prioritize community benefit," Emma explained in her dissertation's conclusion. "The question is whether we can afford not to. Every family that loses transportation loses access to employment, education, healthcare, and community participation. Every small business that prioritizes short-term profit over long-term community relationships contributes to the social isolation and economic instability that make entire communities vulnerable to crisis." On a warm October evening, exactly 15 years after Sarah Chen's BMW had broken down outside Rivera's auto repair, Marcus Rivera stood in the expanded shop that now occupied the entire block, watching his granddaughter Emma Santos Rivera attempt to diagnose a problem with the engine of a small electric vehicle. At 8 years old, little Emma was the daughter of Miguel Santos and Marcus's stepdaughter Sarah Rivera. Sarah Chen had taken Marcus's name when they married, then passed it on to her daughter when Sarah went to medical school. She had inherited the mechanical curiosity that seemed to run in all the extended families connected to Rivera's auto repair, but she approached automotive problems with the assumption that cars should be environmentally sustainable as well as socially accessible. "Abuelo Marcus," she said, using the Spanish term of endearment that had stuck even though Marcus wasn't biologically her grandfather, "I think the problem is in the battery management system, but I want to make sure we can fix it with parts that don't hurt the environment." The shop itself had evolved to reflect changing technology and community needs. Half the bays were now equipped for electric vehicle service, and the training program had expanded to include renewable energy systems and sustainable transportation technology. But the fundamental mission remained the same: providing automotive services that strengthened community resilience rather than extracting wealth from vulnerable families. Marcus smiled as he watched his granddaughter work, remembering his own Emma at that age, drawing pictures of dragons and asking questions about why some people had reliable cars and others didn't. The cycle of curiosity and service was continuing into another generation, but with innovations and improvements that reflected everything the community had learned over the past 15 years. The Community Infrastructure Institute now operated programs in all 50 states and had inspired similar initiatives in 12 other countries. The Bakersfield model had been adapted for different industries, different cultures, and different economic systems, but the core principles remained constant. Businesses could be profitable while serving community needs, individual kindness could be systematized without losing its human character, and local solutions could be scaled without sacrificing local control. Sarah Chin Rivera, now serving as Surgeon General of California, had made community infrastructure a central component of the state's public health strategy. Emma Rivera, now 32, and directing the Federal Office of Community Innovation, was working on legislation that would provide national funding for community infrastructure programs. But the real measure of success wasn't in the awards or the policy victories or the academic recognition. It was in the thousands of families whose lives had been stabilized by access to affordable, reliable transportation. It was in the communities that had resisted displacement because their local businesses prioritized long-term relationships over short-term profits. It was in the young people who had learned that success could be measured by community impact as well as personal achievement. As the sun set over Bakersfield, Marcus looked around the shop that had become the seed for a nationwide movement. The original bay where he'd worked on Sarah's BMW was still operational, still serving customers who needed more than just automotive repair. The walls were covered with photos and thank you notes from families whose lives had been touched by the work that happened here. But the most meaningful decoration was a new drawing by 8-year-old Emma Santos Rivera, displayed prominently near the customer service counter. It showed a community of dragons working together to fix not just cars, but houses and schools and hospitals and parks. Each dragon breathed a different color of starlight, and together their light illuminated a neighborhood where everyone had what they needed to thrive. At the bottom of the drawing, in careful third-grade handwriting, Emma had written, "This is what happens when dragons work together to help everyone find their way home." Marcus Rivera smiled, thinking about the broken radiator that had started it all, about the desperate mother who had become family, about the 6-year-old girl who had taught him that the best dragons shared their starlight instead of hoarding it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve, new ways to demonstrate that businesses could be both profitable and community-serving. But tonight, surrounded by the tools and relationships that had grown out of a single decision to help a stranger in need, Marcus felt the deep satisfaction that came from work that mattered, service that lasted, and love that multiplied. The phone rang, and Marcus answered with the same words he'd been using for 15 years. "Rivera's Auto Repair. Where we fix more than cars, we strengthen communities. How can we help you tonight?" The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, desperate, and grateful to hear another human being willing to listen. Marcus grabbed his keys and headed for the door, ready once again to prove that some problems were too important to wait until tomorrow, that some service was too essential to be limited by business hours, and that sometimes the best response to someone else's crisis was simply to show up with tools and determination, and the unshakable belief that everyone deserves to find their way home. Creating these heartwarming stories takes considerable time and effort. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales.